Hi, I'm Ed. Welcome to Common Sense.
And I'm John. How you
Hey,
doing,
John.
Ed?
I'm good. How about you?
Doing great.
Ready
So,
to go a couple rounds today?
yeah, why not? I got the gloves off and it's like the Yankees socks all over again, right?
Yeah. What happened with that? ESPN said, "Oh, it boiled over." No, it's always boiling. It just doesn't break out
Oh,
into
yeah.
the open like
Well, the pitcher obviously pitched to hit the guy. There's no question about it. So he picked the fight.
that.
Got it. Anyway. All right. So today, we are going to talk a bit about fighting in a sense, internal fighting. And so the question we're raising is, are senior executives responsible? Are they helping or hurting revenue growth? And I think for the purposes of illustration in today's business, let's talk about the more traditional companies, B2B companies, maybe some slightly older companies, because I think what you find in technology and SaaS growth today, their whole business model is rapid revenue growth. So they're going to hire people that know how to get that done. So you're not going to find too many people not doing their job in that scenario. So yeah, let's focus on a 30-year-old or even a 100-year-old company with a more traditional approach. What are your thoughts on who's to blame, so to speak?
All right. Well, I'll start off. Here's the New England in me. I'm not going to hesitate to piss a bunch of people off, but I would say that yes, in general, senior executives and a lot of these traditional kinds of B2B companies are a big time barrier. Um, you know, Here's a perfect example. These are the same people that use the internet for everything. Every time they've got a question about business, they start with a Google search, and just like, everybody else, they get frustrated when they can't find the info they want. And then, despite having that very clear understanding as buyers what they want, they set their websites up for their buyers in the same kind of frustrating way that drives them nuts. I mean, it's hard to understand. These are, often the same people that won't hold their salespeople accountable to using CRM. And, I often use as a measure of where people are in their kind of active engagement in adapting and innovating their business, ask them how much they're reading and what they've read recently. And you ask a lot of these people what the last book they read about sales was or marketing, you kind of get this quizzical look on their face. I mean, they may read about how to improve their golf stroke or something like that, but they're not actively engaged as students of revenue growth. So that's my position, which I'll stick to. But my guess is that you've probably got another perspective on it.
Well, I certainly see your point. I mean, there's no denying that there's a gap between executives at these companies and kind of the latest trends in sales and marketing. But on the other hand, I mean, to be fair to these guys, they are growing budgets every month and every quarter. They are spending more on paid media, for example. So you can't say that they're holding up progress financially. Well, you can, but from the point of view of growing budgets, they certainly are, I think, at least trying. Um, and I can empathize with change in a traditional business environment. It's very difficult to put in place. It's very difficult to completely reorganize your sales teams, for example. And these guys are paying big commissions, so they're committed financially to growth. It's just not necessarily rapid growth, and it's certainly not necessarily high tech, so to speak. From you mentioned CRM. So anyway, just to summarize, I think as Richard Nixon might say, these guys accept the responsibility, but not necessarily the blame for slow sales growth. So what is the culprit for flagging sales? What can we look at that might be standing in the way of rapid growth for more traditional companies?
Well, so obviously, I mean, you make a very valid point. Nobody's setting out to say, no, today I'm going to go to the office, I'm going to slow us down. I mean, they're it's not an intent issue. Their intent is to grow. And I'm sure that every executive that looks at their P&L is very conscious of the huge investment that they're making in growing revenue. And they continue to support it. So, it's not an intent issue. So the question is, where's the disconnect between desire and execution? I would say that, they probably no longer expect their salespeople to go out into the field and use payphones. I mean, not only can you not find them anymore, but they wouldn't expect their salespeople to use them. So they recognize that there is an evolution, there's kind of change that's important, but maybe it comes down to a question of what's the important change, and how do you define what we really need to focus on, what's happening in the market that to which we need to adapt, rather than how can we incrementally change our organization. And buyers, we always come back to the same thing. Buyers and their expectations and their relationship with salespeople and vendors is kind of that critical change. And so what can we take from that? The change really is in what the role of salespeople is. We talk about a blending or a continuum of PR and marketing and sales and service, and that means changes to the org chart, adapting new technology. For instance, what's the role of sales channel? Many of these companies employ sales channel, and many of them just assume, as much as they talk about how it's offering diminishing results and more frustrations, but nobody does anything to change it. How many of their field salespeople are traveling and meeting as frequently as they used to? Not many. I mean, I hear people saying travel budgets are way down. People have many fewer meetings out of the office than they used to. Should these people be inside sales? How can companies provide that kind of educational and research material for buyers if marketing is really focused on, planning trade shows and magazine ads the way they traditionally have? So execs, I would say, are a barrier, kind of boiling it down in three ways. Number one, in many cases, the company is their baby, and they think of it inside out rather than outside in, and they have a really hard time seeing it as a buyer sees it. They probably don't call the main 800 number and work through the switchboard. They probably call their PA and then get directed to whoever they want internally. Second, the activities of a company like that have years of inertia. I heard a funny expression this morning. It's like moving a cemetery. You can't expect the residents to help. Nobody's going to get up and help you move a cemetery. That's the way it is in many of these companies. Change management is really hard. And third, what honestly may be, you could say is a byproduct of the others, or perhaps the biggest challenge, the staff that often they've hired over the years, those that they reward and retain, tend to mirror who they are and who they think kind of the company represents internally. And so you've got largely a bunch of clones, either by personality preference and predilection, or because the behaviors that's been rewarded along the way. So they're not getting a lot of kind of contradictory or provocative sorts of insights and suggestions. So they may be very comfortable motoring along the way they are. When it comes time to stepping outside the comfort zone, though, if we're pushing them, say, hey, look at it from the buyer's perspective, what would you say? I mean, how do they go about doing that? And how do they do it in a way that recognizes they got to keep the current engine running, even if it's only moderately efficient? So how can they keep that running while they begin to adapt?
Yeah, so it sounds like, they have good intentions, but they're stuck. And so,
yeah, great. Exactly. That's a great way to say it.
So it really might take the CEO stepping in at some point and being comfortable saying that, the status quo is not working. Current processes and results that you mentioned, are just not adding up to rapid revenue growth or even meeting goals. So they have to be, starting with the CEO and working down through the executive team, they have to be able to admit that they were wrong, in the past, and that things are not working, the way they would like for the future. So let's assume that they have that courage and they have the right intentions. What should they do? And I think it starts, incrementally with some important recognition or realizations. For example, we've talked about that CEB research study that shows, 6 to 7 team members for any kind of buyer these days. It's really not about focusing on one buyer persona or one decision maker.
Right.
That's a big mistake we're making that could be corrected relatively easily just by kind of changing the process, changing the mindset with the sales team and with marketing as well. And then the second thing is really, as you mentioned earlier, focusing on that buyer experience, that visitor, buyer, lead, all the different stages of the buyer journey. What's that experience like for them, and how focused is the company, through its people, through its training, through its culture? How is that focused on that experience? And then, you have to be able to be brave about this, make suggestions that are somewhat difficult, changes that need to be made, even though they're not traditional, even though they may require some changes in staffing and certainly changes in strategy. So, those two things, recognition of what's going on, and then having the courage and the commitment to do something about it is really the key. And then that's not enough by itself. You have to be able to measure progress. You have to have plans in place. You have to do analytics. You have to see where how you're developing in this process to change. And then you need to think beyond today too. You've got to think down the road 5 to 10 years, decide where you want to be. And is this plan, is this roadmap you're on going to get you there? So I'm probably asking for too much, don't you think?
No, absolutely not. I mean, what you're describing, I would say, is exactly the way senior execs need to be thinking about it. And unfortunately, often they aren't. Some of it is just, everyone's so busy, head down, worried about payroll and, this report that's, they're obliged to send to this agency or whatever, and customer complaints about something, and it's really hard to carve out that time to look ahead 5 or 10 years and to think about the issues strategically. But hesitance to change or resistance to change isn't an excuse for failure to change. And it's okay to say, we can't manage this right now, we're going to look at it later, but it's not okay to just ignore the changes that are happening in the background. And, it's easy for us because we're able to work with companies that recognize this and want to change. And those that say, we want help, we want these kind of ideas. And not every company is like that. And that's okay. Some companies can continue to do the things they want to. And the life cycle of that company will be adequate for the people that own it. And those are decisions that people that own businesses have to make. But for those that want to change, you've laid out kind of a great roadmap, and that North Star, people talk more and more about North Star. As the North Star, the real gauge for what you're doing and how you're doing it is to solve for the buyer. So if you're going to solve for the buyer, I'd say some common sense steps include look to other industries that tend to be leaders. What are they doing? So look at sales in SaaS software, for instance, and see what kind of technology they're using, how they're changing their sales model. What's the role of inside sales? What's the role of this trend toward chat and real-time conversation with people over technology? Start thinking about revenue growth and enterprise valuation. And that means predictability, scalability, value of data assets, etc., instead of just marketing and sales. Marketing and sales are often very tactical as opposed to bigger picture kind of things. Assume that everybody on the team is entitled to an opportunity to participate in this change and in this new model, but at the same time, recognize and begin to socialize the fact that adaptation and creativity are going to be important skills, and those that don't have that, may not kind of fit in, because those are going to be critical criteria. You're going to encourage conflicting ideas, and not just in the suggestion box or once a year meeting where the CEO says, oh, we embrace everybody and diversity is great and give us your ideas, and then ignore them. But I mean, you have to really encourage them and engage with them. And certainly there's some crackpot ideas, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff that can be developed through conversation, may not end up in its ultimate form being where the kernel of the idea was originally, but that kernel can prompt some really interesting stuff. And you gotta get insights from others, whether it's through reading or through associations, not peers, not companies in the same industry with people that fit the same demographic profile, but really blending ideas from other businesses and other industries. Does that sound reasonable?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, to me and you, it sounds reasonable, but the problem is that, you know, a CEO might go, well, what are you talking about? You know, I don't see the need to do this. So I think it really starts with a serious wake up call. And one of my favorite examples I read in a post yesterday by Jeremy Epstein in VentureBeat. And he was talking about General Stanley McChrystal, who was in charge of the troops, as you know, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And things were really out of control there. You were really fighting an asymmetric war against an enemy that was dispersed all around, and you know, really didn't need to worry about strategy very much. You know, they just could attack at the edges. And it was very difficult for a conventional army or Air Force or Navy or anybody to try to fight that kind of warfare. We just weren't used to it. So McChrystal, he was, you know, in charge. He was basically the CEO over there. And, you know, he really said, we need to change. We need to really start rethinking the way we fight battles, the way we deploy resources, you know, the way we think about the enemy even. And I think this is actually very similar to what we're facing in business today. These changes we're seeing in sales and marketing and customer service, they're out there on the edges. You know, it's not a central thing. There's not a group we're fighting here. It's really every day, and it's every interaction with every customer. So you really have to start rethinking the way you do these things. So I think this would be a good wake-up call, and you can see the same kinds of things going on in your industry, I'm sure. And from there, you know, stop thinking about individual tactics. Think about a whole new wave of strategies that might include digital channels, that includes a more customer-centric viewpoint, you know, that might ultimately change your entire culture, your organization. You know, you have to think along those lines in order to, you know, make these changes. So with that, I think let's wrap it up. I guess our conclusion is that management is both responsible and to blame for some extent, or to some extent. But you know, these things are big changes that are out there that require, you know, a flexible approach, a new way of thinking. So they can also be a great asset if they embrace these things.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, you know, as is the goal of these confrontational, this kind of taking two positions and working toward the middle, I think we've ended up at a far more reasonable position than either of us staked out initially. Hopefully people enjoyed it, and we kind of finished touching on the topic of culture, which is exactly where we're going to go next time. And you may wonder how we can argue about the importance of culture, but we'll figure out a way. So thank you for joining us. For now, that's this issue of Common Sense. I'm Ed.
And I'm John. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.